It is the winter of 1943. A senior officer of the German High Command sits down to dinner in his private quarters somewhere in the heart of occupied Europe. The meal is unremarkable, rationed, austere, the grim fare of a nation stretched thin by total war. But there is on this particular evening something special. A small luxury, a bar of dark chocolate wrapped in plain paper, bearing no markings that would raise suspicion. Someone, a staff officer perhaps, or a quartermaster with good connections, has managed to procure it. The officer reaches for the bar. He peels back the wrapper. He snaps off a single square. He never gets a second. What the officer has in his hands, or rather, what he had in his hands, is not really chocolate at all. It is a precision explosive device, constructed by some of the most creative and ruthless minds in British intelligence, designed to detonate the moment a piece is broken from the bar. The explosion is not massive. It does not level buildings, but in the confined space of a private room, across a dinner table, in the company of a high-ranking German commander. It does not need to be massive. It needs only to be lethal. This is the story of Britain's exploding chocolate. It is a story of desperation dressed up as ingenuity, of assassination plots and clandestine laboratories, of a war fought not only on the beaches and in the skies, but in the mind, and occasionally on the dinner table. It is a story that sounds, at first, like something invented for a comedy sketch. But the chocolate was real, the intent was real, and the targets, had they been reached, might have changed the course of the Second World War. By the time the exploding chocolate was being developed in earnest, Britain's Special Operations Executive, the SOE, had already been running covert operations across occupied Europe for the better part of 3 years. Established in July 1940 on the direct orders of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who famously instructed his new organization to set Europe ablaze. The SOE was unlike anything Britain had created before. It was not an army. It was not an intelligence service in any conventional sense. It was, at its core, a sabotage organization, a body of men and women whose explicit purpose was to cause chaos, disruption, and death behind enemy lines. The challenge the SOE faced was a fundamental one of access. German commanders, senior Nazi officials, and high-value military targets did not wander casually into range of Allied snipers. They lived inside concentric rings of security, bodyguards, checkpoints, tasters, and procedures refined by years of paranoia. The most obvious methods of assassination were, by the early 1940s, essentially impossible to employ directly. Shooting Hitler required getting close enough to shoot Hitler. Poisoning Himmler required access to his food. Every obvious approach had been anticipated, and elaborate countermeasures were already in place. What the SOE's technical division, operating from a series of requisitioned country houses and suburban workshops scattered across southern England, needed was something that exploited a gap in German security thinking, something that did not look like a weapon, something that a man might willingly pick up and bring to his own lips. The challenge was not just technical, it was psychological. They needed to think like the enemy's blind spots. Germany, by 1943, was a nation under strain. Rationing had bitten deep into civilian life, and even for the officer class, pampered as they were by the standards of occupied territories, small luxuries had become genuinely precious. Chocolate, in particular, had taken on an almost totemic significance. It was a symbol of pre-war abundance, of normalcy, of the kind of life the war had suspended. A bar of good chocolate, in the right circles, was not merely food. It was a status symbol. It was the sort of thing a man might not question too carefully if it appeared on his desk. That was the gap, the SOE's boffins, a peculiarly British word for the peculiarly British occupation of brilliant, slightly eccentric technical genius, decided to exploit. The department responsible for developing what would become the exploding chocolate bar operated out of Station 9, one of the SOE's most important technical facilities, located at the Fryth, a country house near Welwyn in Hertfordshire. The Fryth was an extraordinary place, a Georgian manor house converted into a clandestine laboratory, staffed by chemists, engineers, former gamesmen, and inventors of various persuasions, all working under conditions of absolute secrecy to produce the weapons and devices that agents would carry into occupied Europe. The challenge of creating a convincing explosive chocolate bar was, on its face, almost absurd. But the engineers at the Fryth approached it with complete seriousness. The device had to achieve several things simultaneously and with no compromise on any one of them. It had to look, smell, and feel indistinguishable from genuine chocolate. It had to survive handling, transportation, and the various customs and inspections that any item passing through occupied territory would face. And it had to detonate reliably when, and only when, a piece was broken from the bar, without any premature triggering during the earlier handling. The mechanism they developed was elegant in its simplicity. The explosive compound used was a specially formulated plastic explosive, related to the British-developed RDX-based compounds that were already seeing widespread use in SOE devices, molded and shaped to precisely replicate the dimensions and texture of a real chocolate bar. The exterior was then coated in a thin layer of real dark chocolate, applied with sufficient care that the weight, the surface sheen, the slight brittleness under the fingers, and even the smell were convincingly authentic. The trigger mechanism was the key innovation. Running through the interiors of the bar, precisely where the natural break point of the chocolate would be located, was a fine steel rod connected to a tension spring and a small percussion cap. When a standard chocolate bar is snapped, and any person who has ever handled good dark chocolate knows the satisfying crack of it, the break releases mechanical stress across the whole bar simultaneously. The SOE's device replicated this break point exactly, but where a real bar would simply snap, this one would release the spring, drive the rod into the percussion cap, and initiate the explosive charge. The entire device weighed roughly the same as a genuine bar of similar dimensions, approximately 100 grams or just under 4 ounces, and was produced in at least 2 documented variants, one slightly thicker than the other to accommodate different detonation timings. The chocolate coating was real enough to pass a casual visual inspection, and reportedly convincing enough to fool a cursory sniff. It would not have survived a chemist's analysis, but it did not need to. It needed to survive a tired German officer reaching into a box without thinking too hard. Production of the devices was handled within the Fryth complex, with the actual explosive cores produced separately and the chocolate coating applied in a controlled environment. Exact production numbers remain classified or simply unrecorded. The SOE was not by its nature an organization that kept meticulous paperwork. but it is believed that at least several dozen examples were manufactured for operational testing and potential deployment. The operational history of the exploding chocolate is, by necessity, fragmentary. The SOE's files, many of which were deliberately destroyed at the end of the war to protect agents and methods, do not contain a single definitive account of a successful detonation in the field. What we do know comes from a combination of surviving internal memoranda, post-war interviews with SOE personnel, and, most dramatically, a German counterintelligence discovery that very nearly blew the entire program open. In early 1943, German military intelligence, the Abwehr, appears to have become aware of the existence of the exploding chocolate program. The precise source of this intelligence leak has never been definitively established, though SOE security in this period was notoriously porous, with German agents having successfully penetrated several of the organization's networks in the Netherlands and elsewhere. What the Germans learned was specific enough to be alarming: that British intelligence was producing food-shaped explosives intended for use against senior personnel. The response was immediate. A notice was circulated to German senior officers, warning them to be suspicious of chocolate, and indeed of any unexpected food items, particularly those received as gifts from unknown or unverified sources. The warning was taken seriously enough that food tasting protocols, already standard for the very highest ranks, were extended to a much wider circle of officers. Any chocolate bar arriving in unusual circumstances was to be reported and examined rather than consumed. The intelligence failure, if it was one, may paradoxically have served the SOE's purposes in a different way. Even a weapon that is never used imposes a cost on the enemy. Every senior German officer who spent the remaining years of the war slightly suspicious of his chocolate, slightly hesitant before unwrapping a gift bar, represented a small but real tax on German mental ease. Psychological warfare, the SOE well understood, did not require detonation to be effective. It is worth pausing here to consider what the British were doing in context, because the exploding chocolate did not exist in isolation. By 1943, the SOE's technical division had developed an extraordinary range of concealed explosive devices, many of which stretched the definition of what a weapon could look like. There were explosive lumps of coal, called black beetles, designed to be mixed with genuine coal supplies destined for German railway engines, detonating when shoveled into a firebox and causing boiler explosions. There were explosive rats, which had never quite worked as intended and became something of an internal SOE joke after the Germans discovered a cache of them and put them on display as a propaganda curiosity. There were explosive tire busters disguised as animal droppings, designed to puncture lorry tires on occupied roads. The Americans, working through the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the American equivalent of the SOE, were pursuing similar programs with similar ingenuity. OSS documents from the same period record the development of explosive flour, explosive motor oil, and a range of disguised incendiary devices intended for use in Japanese-occupied territories in the Pacific. The thinking on both sides of the Atlantic was convergent. In a war where the physical battlefield had expanded to encompass every factory, every railway, and every headquarters building in occupied Europe, any object could in principle be a weapon. German efforts in the same area were less documented, but not absent. The Wehrmacht and SS maintained their own sabotage units, the Brandenburg Division and later the SS Special Operations branches, and produced concealed explosive devices of their own. But German thinking tended toward the mechanical, disguised timing devices, modified shells, rather than the food-based deception that characterized the British approach. Whether this reflects a difference in strategic culture, a different assessment of opportunities, or simply different engineering traditions is difficult to say. What is clear is that no German equivalent of the exploding chocolate has been documented in the historical record. The chocolate approach, in retrospect, reflected something distinctly British about the SOE's methodology. A willingness to exploit social assumptions, a flair for the theatrical, and a deep understanding that an enemy's confidence in normality was itself a vulnerability. If you are finding this fascinating, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps stories like this one coming. The legacy of the exploding chocolate is genuinely difficult to assess, for the simple reason that, as with so much of the SOE's work, the archive is incomplete and the outcomes are opaque. There is no documented case of a German officer being killed by one. There is no battle that turned on its use, no operation that succeeded or failed because of a chocolate bar. By the conventional metrics of military effectiveness, it was a weapon that never fired. And yet, the SOE's food weapon program had an influence that extended well beyond the Second World War. The fundamental concept, concealing an explosive or incendiary device inside an object so culturally unremarkable that it bypasses security screening, became a standard element of covert operations doctrine in the post-war period. The CIA, the KGB, British intelligence, and numerous other services developed and refined variations on the same theme across the following decades. The specific technical challenge of making an explosive device that faithfully replicates both the visual and physical properties of a legitimate object, including its weight, texture, and behavior under handling, is one that special operations engineers have returned to repeatedly. The original surviving examples of the exploding chocolate, or what are believed to be examples, are extraordinarily rare. The Imperial War Museum in London holds documents relating to SOE food weapon programs, and several British museums hold other examples of SOE concealed weapons, though the specifics of what survives remain subject to ongoing archival work. The Frith, where so many of these devices were created, no longer exists as an intelligence facility. The house eventually became a conference center, its wartime secrets embedded in its walls and largely forgotten by those who passed through it. What can be said with certainty is that the people who built the exploding chocolate understood something profound about the nature of modern warfare. That it was not only fought with tanks and aircraft and submarines, but with ideas, with deception, with the exploitation of the gap between what an enemy expects and what is actually true. They looked at a chocolate bar, the most innocent, most ordinary, most human of objects, and they saw a weapon. And in seeing it, they changed in some small but permanent way how we think about the relationship between the ordinary and the deadly. Return now to that winter evening of 1943. Return to the German officer and his dinner table and his bar of chocolate. The scene has not changed. The wrapper still gleams dully in the lamplight. The officer's hand is still outstretched. The bar is still there. Somewhere in a converted country house in Hertfordshire, men and women who will never be famous whose names appear only in fragments of classified documents or not at all, have spent months thinking about this moment. They have measured chocolate bars. They have studied the precise mechanical properties of cocoa solids under stress. They have tested detonation thresholds and spring tensions and the minimum explosive charge needed to be reliable without being immediately obvious. They have done all of this in the service of a single, very specific hope, that a man will reach for a bar of chocolate without thinking about it. Because that is what people do. They reach for chocolate without thinking. The extraordinary thing about the exploding chocolate, the thing that makes it more than merely curious, is what it reveals about the total nature of the war. By 1943, Britain was fighting Germany not only in the Atlantic and in North Africa and in the skies above the Channel, but in the very concept of what was safe. Every object in an occupied country was potentially a weapon. Every gift was potentially lethal. Every chocolate bar was potentially a death sentence. The SOE's genius, if genius is the right word for something so grimly purposeful, lay in recognizing that trust itself was a resource and that trust could be destroyed. The Germans, when they issued their warnings about chocolate in 1943, understood this too. They understood that the British had not simply created a weapon. They had poisoned a small but real portion of everyday certainty. Chocolate had been, up to that moment, one of the things you did not need to think about. Afterwards, for those who had received the warning, it never quite was again. There is a particular kind of victory that belongs to the intelligence services rather than the armies. It is not measured in ground taken or ships sunk. It is measured in seconds of hesitation, in small persistent anxieties, in the slight but irreversible erosion of the enemy's confidence in the world around him. The exploding chocolate almost certainly never killed anyone. But in making a German officer pause before his bar of chocolate, in planting that seed of uncertainty, in colonizing that tiny corner of his mind, it achieved something that 100 conventional weapons could not. The bar on the table gleams. The officer's hand is outstretched. He hesitates. And that, perhaps, was always the point.